A bit about myself and creation research first. Craig Hawkins has a master's degree in science and he's not long ago joined creation research, and he and I were asked to do a debate against two of Australia's leading atheists who are involved in their evolutionary teaching. The newspapers got hold of it, and as a result the auditorium was packed. Yes, you've guessed right, my accent is from a little south of the border, way south, down under in Australia. But it was interesting the way the debate was described in the newspaper next day. Now that's an interesting combination of words. Do you realise this is a subject where there are certain prejudices? Usually they're quite strong. You may have those tonight, I may have them, but look, what we're going to do is try and get you to listen to well, I can't say we're going to cover the whole subject because it's so big we would not get through it. And if you're an atheist or if you're a fundamentalist Christian, I can't please you all, so I have no intention of even trying. But it was interesting how the newspapers portrayed the evolutionist losers the next day. You see, if you're an evolutionist, then this is how the newspaper saw you. You see, you really do believe that Bill Gates is just an over-evolved cousin of an orangutan or some sort of animal, and there was no intelligent design or creation. Well, you'll notice there's some resources over there, and many of these debates are on DVD and available. But what's interesting about them is they almost always create a furore. It's not one of those silent subjects. That's me, by the way, dressed up as Moses on Mount Sinai in the Sydney Morning Herald. And look at the quote at the top. Darwin's evolutionary theory is a tottering nonsense built on too many suppositions. That's actually a very accurate quote, by the way. And tonight I want to get behind the scenes and look at some of those suppositions. But whether it's Australia or the UK, we seem to attract a bit of attention. Why is this so provocative? Why such a fuss? Well, there's several directions we can go in, and here's one. I was in England when Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson said that. I don't believe in God. How could I, given my great-great-grandfather's theories? But perhaps I'd feel happier if I did. Just because I've rejected conventional religion, and in this context, it means Christianity. Just because I've rejected conventional religion, it does not mean there isn't a void to be filled. Now, what's the connection between the theory of evolution that his great-great-grandfather is famous for and Christianity? Well, there's a statement from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ has got a little to do with Christianity, you've probably guessed, but that's a statement out of John's Gospel, so no wonder Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson has problems with Christianity, because Christianity's founder said, if you don't believe Moses is the guy associated with the Ten Commandments. One of the Ten Commandments is in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth. So if you don't believe that, you don't believe Moses, you'll have trouble with Jesus Christ. But there is another side as well. Science Teachers Association in most countries. Here's one of the big journals for them. Scientists refrain from considering God's actions in their work. Instead, they use observation, experimentation, logical arguments, heuristics. Now, I'll guarantee most science teachers have no idea what heuristics are, but it's a big word. Healthy skepticism to view scientific knowledge and look at the bit in yellow. Scientific theories are therefore explanations about aspects of nature without reference to God, which, by the way, is a reference to God. You can't get away from it. But basically what it does is the one thing the science teachers try to actually avoid. They have just told me that science is officially atheistic or agnostic. Question. If it is true that God created the heavens and the earth, by definition, it's not in the scientist ballpark, so you can't talk about it. Doesn't mean it's false, it just means we've locked it out by definition. I wonder what we should do about definitions like that. Because obviously Isaac Newton, as a Christian creationist, was not bound by that sort of definition. Well, let's show you some textbooks that are. Here's a current textbook in use in many schools, and as part of its evidence for evolution, it's got diagrams like this. You see the shark embryo, the bird embryo, or the human embryo. The argument is they've all got things in common, like gill slits. By the way, this textbook is 2006 printing. This is a new textbook in biology for all practical purposes. Funny thing, sharks, birds, fishes, people, all got gill slits. They've all got tails. Despite the fact that in, Science, the Times, August 11th, 1997, you can follow up the original Dr. Michael Richardson, who'd photographed the embryos, basically said Professor Haeckel's original diagram showing all the similarities of gill slits and tails are fakes, and always have been. Interesting, because you see, here's another diagram out of what could qualify as a textbook. This guy here was an author, and I know that because, you see, when I was a student at university, not only did I decide to do geology, I quickly discovered that us geologists, we were undertakers. We just dug up dead things. So I decided to take 3 years of genetics and to find out how living things worked. And the man whose diagram this is, we used his textbooks in third year genetics in Queensland University. Two things were very evident. One is he was an atheist. Two is he firmly believed he was a monkey's uncle. He was quite an ardent evolutionist. Funny thing, by the time he got round to doing this diagram, that we never had gill slits and we don't have a vestigial tail, he was the author of this book, Creation, the Facts of Life. His name, Dr. Gary Parker. Funny thing, they don't use his textbooks in Queensland University anymore. This is an issue where prejudices are quite profound. Well, why are you here tonight? Do you want to fight religion versus science? Or do you want to fight truth versus error? Because if you want to fight the first one, I'd encourage you, enrol in the philosophy department. They will keep you happily occupied having this debate for the next 20 years. You may even get a PhD, which will probably not qualify you to get a job anywhere on this subject, and you'll never sort it out. On the other hand, is it true that we have gill slits, or is it false? Is it true that our tailbone is left over from evolution? Or is it false? By the way, I'm well qualified to answer that one because you're looking at one of the few people who's experimented in this, because I tore all the ligaments off my tailbone one year and I staggered into the doctors in utter agony, and he just laughed at me. He said, "I can tell you what's wrong with you." I said, "Whatever it is, Doc, do something about it." And he said, "You've torn the ligaments on your tailbone." I said, "Doc, whatever it is, fix it. I can't sit down, and if I'm standing up, and if I'm sitting down, I can't stand up." That's because, by the way, your tailbone is the anchor for all those muscles that enable you to do those things. It's not vestigial, never was as far as we can figure out. Well, there's lots of applications of this, but they all tend to get an emotive response. We brought out this year, climate change and creation. It's not quite saying what Al Gore is saying. It can be provocative. So far we haven't got a Nobel Prize for it, but I can't figure out why you get Nobel Peace Prizes for movies on the weather. But you might want to ask questions about that a little later. I'm going to primarily try and deal with issues like that. Why is this issue so provocative? What's the evidence for, against, etc.? Because there's the big picture. On the left-hand corner, molecules that aren't alive. Somehow, due to the natural properties of the universe, become more sophisticated. They eventually become so sophisticated, things like DNA and RNA appear on the planet, and it's encapsulated, and finally it evolves into newer and newer products till eventually we appear on the planet, and now we're trying to leave and go to other planets and see what's out there. The students' appreciation of that, that's the normal sort of picture. On the left-hand side is a chimpanzee, on the right-hand side is Gordon Brown. That's the picture we have. And by the way, that seems to be what he believes. And it flows over in his interest in, giving people permission to mix stem cells of animals and people, because why? Why not? Man's not unique. By the way, the traditional conviction is man is made in God's image, so man is unique. But now you're back to creation versus evolution again. There's a good question to start the night off. What did Darwin graduate in? Yes, he did attend Edinburgh University to study medicine, but apparently he sicked up after a couple of operations, and his father recommended he take up theology, so he graduated with a master's degree in theology. All right, question. If you were studying theology in the early 1800s before somebody called Charles Darwin wrote a book on evolution, guess what other book you would have studied as part of your education? Answer, the Bible. Charles Darwin knew his Bible. By the way, Pastor Pete, you claim to be a Christian? Okay, Genesis is in the Bible? Okay, Charles Darwin knew what was in Genesis because when he sailed on the Beagle, he had what you'd call a fundamentalist evangelical ship's captain who made sure everybody knew what was in the Bible. Look what it says. God created, he created things after their kind, and God saw that it was good. And if you want to know what good means, there's one thought. All creatures began vegetarian. Nothing killed anything else to stay alive. No bars on the zoo in the Garden of Eden. Now, I think you described that as a much better planet than the one we've got now, where it's kill or be killed, survival of the fittest, etc. But look at the rest of the history. Oh, you see, and this is where we need to be challenged a little bit. If God made the world good and things have gone the way the biblical account of creation says, I wonder what the evidence would be. You see, you and I don't normally ask that question because you think Pastor Pete's a religious man and the stuff that he says is about religion. But the biblical account is not just about what you'd call normally a religion, it's about what animals ate in the beginning. It's about a world that was different, and it's about a world that's changed. But then the theory of evolution is about a world that's changed. How would you tell the difference? You see, there's basically the bottom line. I don't know if you've sort of tried to get involved in counselling people when there's a dispute, but one of the simplest things to do is reduce the dispute to the most simple, obvious difference and then talk through that one. Evolution basically says you started out as molecules that weren't people, you turned into amoebas that weren't people, you became worms that weren't people, and some of us have gotten right up to the people stage. We don't produce our own kind. There's the history of the world, from nothing to nature to nurture, and don't think it's stopped. If evolution is true, there is no reason why we should remain like we are. Very few people take that seriously except for the sci-fi movie makers, because they love to portray us on Star Trek as over-evolved creatures in a million years' time. In fact, it doesn't matter what version of evolution you claim to adhere to. You see, when I was a student, Darwinism was going out, neo-Darwinism was in. Now, if you're at the forefront, you're passing from neo-Darwinism to punctuated equilibrium. But it doesn't matter which one you have, they all basically say the same thing. We started out as molecules that weren't people. We've ended up as people that aren't just simply molecules. But I want to be dogmatic. Charles Darwin knew what he was setting out to prove, and he knew what he was setting out to disprove. Do you realise if you want to be a good researcher, you not only have to figure out how to prove something, you have to figure out how to disprove things as well. I mean, you're going to invent a new drug to put hair back on bald Irish people. The government just doesn't let you sell it. You have to first of all test it to prove that not only will it make hair, it won't make your eyes fall out. So you have to ask the positives and the negatives. Well, why do I say Charles Darwin deliberately set out to do that? Let's learn a little bit about it. You see, have you heard the comment that creation is not falsifiable, so it can't be included in science? I think that's nonsense, because Charles Darwin was basically setting out to disprove it, because he knew exactly what he was doing. So if you can argue Genesis says this, but if evolution is true, I should expect that, then you've established a method by which you can falsify a particular position. His observations, his conclusions, Well, you read most of them in that book, don't you? The origin of species by means of natural selection. The preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life by Charles Darwin. In those days, you didn't need to read the rest of the book. The title said it all. They were very wordy. But you notice one thing? Life is a struggle. It never was good. So their two starting points are radically different. If you put Charles Darwin's glasses on, there's what your worldview becomes. How you explain everything. We're here because the fittest survive. It's a struggle. Natural selection is what happens. Kill or be killed. Only the strongest make it. Death is part of the system. Stiff cheese, that's the way it is. And look at the bottom one. Any change is evidence of what you and I call evolution. Well, Charles Darwin could probably be blamed for giving us that mindset, even though some of those existed as concepts before, but they are not part of what he learned in his theology course that tells you God made everything good and that there was no death, no struggle. The world started in a totally different position. Let's take a university textbook. How does it argue for Darwin's position? The standard one? I mean, Darwin himself was so impressed with these finches. Well, his diagram wasn't as sophisticated as that because the textbook basically tells you the finches on the Galapagos Islands had a South American ancestor. And then the textbook goes on to tell you the evidence for evolution. Well, look at these beautiful family trees. Now, look, let's be honest. We have never seen a finch fly from South America to the Galapagos Islands. We have never seen any of that happen. It's a logical argument based on beliefs about, well, let's give you how Charles Darwin reached it. He sailed to the Galapagos Islands on the Beagle. The Galapagos Islands straddle the equator. His conclusion, he saw different finches with different beaks on the Galapagos Islands. And since the Galapagos Islands are largely volcanic, they can't have been very old, so these finches can't have dated back to creation. So therefore, if there's no finches like this anywhere on the planet, they must have come from the nearby mainland. His theory, ultimately, finches from South America gave 8 species of finch on the Galapagos. But look, most textbooks make the next step appear very logical. Therefore, hydrogen evolved into people. By the way, that's why they start with Miller's amino acid experiment as the section on evolution, the origin of life. Now, Charles Darwin didn't get that far in his first book because you can still read references to a creator. But by the time he gets to the descent of man, he's left the creator right out of it. Why? Why would he set out to do this? There's no doubt about it, he's doing that. He didn't put it into those neat words, but that's where we've got to, whether your name is David Attenborough or you or me. You define evolution as change. You see, I remember when we were doing genetics, the professors were struggling to try and tell us a usable definition of evolution. E means out of, V as in volume, to come out of. Okay? By the time you define it as a change in gene frequency, well, you can change the gene frequency without having evolution just by shifting the number of people around in the room and changing the number of black ones and white ones. But that's not evolution either. So ultimately, you just call it change. Then you accept any change in finches as proof of evolution, and as a result, Darwin and most others included would say if that's true, then the creation of finches is impossible. Okay, why such a fuss? Oh, you see, Charles Darwin reached some conclusions. Well, they're portrayed as conclusions. You see, if it is true that the finches on South America evolved into 8 different species of finches, therefore the Old Testament, with its manifestly false history of the world, you see, he was a theologian. If you're someone here who's trying to mix Christian theology, the biblical account of creation, and the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin would have been the first to disagree with you. You see, he knew what he was on about. He knew what he was setting out to prove. He knew what he was setting out to disprove. And in his history of the world, there never was a time when the world was good. There never was a time when all the lions lay down with the lamb and they both ate grass just like the ox. So the Old Testament has to be manifestly false. Okay? Prejudices? Try this one. Written by Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson in Science. That's a fairly prestigious magazine. Not too long ago, 2002, after Annie's death, Charles Darwin set the Christian faith firmly behind him, freed from the last vestige of belief that the world was perfect because God made it that way. Darwin continued without restraint to work out his theory on the origin of species. Now, I'll guarantee that was not in your biology textbook. I was amazed to find it even printed in Science. But if you're wondering what it means, I was down in Charles Darwin's house area, and it's interesting to hear from the locals and to read the biographies and that are around. Do you know Charles Darwin went to church every Sunday of his life? But after his favourite daughter Annie died, he never went back inside. You see, he did what many people do. If there is a God of love, why did my poor little innocent girl die? So every Sunday after that, he went to church, but he sat outside publicly protesting. Question, why wasn't that in your biology book? Because we're portraying Charles Darwin as a person devoid of presuppositions, who has no extra agenda, who's actually setting out to reach pure scientific conclusions. And there's no such thing. You see, Charles Darwin's great-grandson, he is the guy who argued that. I don't believe in God. How could I? But then Charles Darwin set out to get rid of this God. In fact, he was so angry at this God that he ruled him out. The Bible has to be ultimately false. And if you think I'm stretching it, look at our friend Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard Dawkins is well known for having a very strong opinion. In fact, usually if he's in a university a couple of weeks before me, my lectures have a huge number of people because he is so strongly opinionated on atheistic evolutionism. And look what he says. Although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. There is a connection between evolution, rejection of Christianity, evolution, telling me the Bible is not true. So don't be surprised. This sort of discussion creates lots of provocative reactions. If you're an atheist, you may not like Dawkins saying that. If you're a Christian, you may not have even realised that Darwin had an attitude about the Christian church that was influenced by the death of his daughter, and his theory follows. You might want to go to our 3D website sometime, because tonight's a fairly brief exposure. As I said, I can't cover everything, so I don't intend to. So a lot more on there. The search engine there is really great, particularly if you like playing with 3D fossils and that as well. Let's check our Finch facts, however, and see where we really get to. I'll ask the question which many people wouldn't ask. And as I keep telling people all around the world, you only get the answers to the questions that you ask. And if you haven't asked what Charles Darwin's finches actually prove, I mean, do they really prove evolution? This guy reported in New Scientist a few years ago that crossbreeds or hybrids between Darwin's finches are relatively common. They can fly, sing, court, and have fertile offspring. Now, your basic definition is if you take a horse, which is one species, and a donkey, which is another species, when you cross them, the mule is sterile, or if it breeds, it won't breed true. So that's your farmer's rule of a definition of different species, and it works pretty well. These guys can interbreed, and they do so successfully, and their offspring are all fertile. In fact, to go a little further, they've even redone experiments where you take the finches, put them on South East Island, they spread to the 3 nearby islands over the next 20 years, and by the 1980s they have different shaped beaks and different shaped tail feathers, etc. 20 years? Something else is happening apart from what you normally call evolution. In fact, they've done it in America, shift the finches from New York to Alabama, California to Montana, and after 30 years, they look totally different. Now, that's too fast for what you and I normally call evolution, so what's going on? Well, you can look up that paper in depth if you like, But in reality, it tells us that we now know how finches change their beak shapes. They've got a little hormone detector built into their beak, so if you take them to Island A and they pick hard food, then the next generation will respond to that hard food depending on how these hormones are released, stretch their beak, fatten it, thicken it. It's got nothing to do with evolution at all. Same way as you come to Australia, take your shoes off, run around on the beach. For the first week it hurts like crazy. After that, the hormones start reacting, your foot builds more skin. And then you come back to Scotland, put your shoes back on, and your body cancels the instruction and your feet simply peel off. That's what's really happening with the finches. In fact, if you ask, is it evolution or is it merely what they used to call adaptation? You see, if evolution is true, you could adapt. But if you can adapt, you can often do so without evolving at all. It's actually an already existing feature that only shows up when the circumstances change. No birds have evolved on the Galapagos because there's no mutations that anybody can detect that are involved at all. In fact, if you go a little further, there's some of the South American finches, straight out of our textbooks. Here's their derived Galapagos finches. You've probably never seen pictures like that. They don't show up in many textbooks, but it is interesting to ask a more profound question. What have we actually proved in watching these finches for 170 years? Answer, finches with beaks have produced finches with beaks. Now, when I say it that way, it almost sounds silly. But that is what we've actually observed. So is this an unreasonable conclusion? I mean, if you were trying to test whether Darwin was right or wrong, and his concept was that things do not produce their own kind, and you've got 170 years of evidence that finches do, I'll say you label them different species because you think their beak shapes are significant, when they can actually all interbreed. This one's in every textbook. I hope it comes out soon. The peppered moth. Manchester, the 1950s, Dr. Kettlewell. As the trees got dirty in the Industrial Revolution, the birds had trouble seeing the dark moths. Eventually they could only see the light moths, so they ate them. End result, dark moths increased, light moths decreased. Then you get your British government passing the Clean Air Act, and the trees become so clean that unless you put red arrows on the white moths, they're almost impossible to see. End result, dark moths decrease, light moths increase as the birds can see them. Sounds logical. It was very logical to me as a university student, but so logical you never bother to actually go and check. When you check, did the numbers change? Well, I went to the Natural History Museum in London. You get out their count trays, assuming they're reliable, of course, and I've got no reason to suggest they aren't. In the 1900s, there was a large percentage of dark moths. By the time you get to 1850, there was only a small number of dark moths. Okay, we can prove the numbers have changed. But actually, you started with both dark and light moths, and you ended with dark and light moths. What have you actually proved? Here's the famous photograph, very convincing. On the left-hand side, dark moths on dark bark. On the right-hand side, light moths on dark bark. Obviously, if you're a bird, you should be able to see the light ones easier. Famous evidence in every textbook for evolution. One reason I think it won't stay there is this review of a book by Michael Majoris. You never heard of him? He's a moth expert. And look what he says. We've been sitting around Manchester for 40 years and we've seen 2 moths land on the trees. Now that's not overwhelming database about the moths being on the trees. In fact, he says Dr. Kettlewell actually put his moths on the trees. In fact, it turns out he seems to have glued them on the trees for his photograph, which is not normal scientific procedure, I hope. In fact, he released his moths during the day when normally they only get out at night. In fact, you can go to the USA and go to their count trays and you'll discover that the same change in numbers occurred in the USA where they never had dirty trees. What's going on? In fact, Majoris goes on to say, finally, the results of Kettlewell's experiments have never been replicated in any later studies. Now, if you're involved in science education, you ordinarily assume that anything that's in a science textbook has got there because the experiments have been done over and over again. But I hate to tell you this, when it comes to the evolutionary section, that is not usually true. They've got in there before because they're logical and they're consistent with the worldview of evolution, despite the objections. You see, I was asked to do a debate by Sky TV last year against one of your evolutionists, and they held it in the Manchester Museum research centre thing there. They had a new display. Why did the moth change its spots? Well, this is the area where the moths were. Here's a picture of dirty old Manchester, and here, if you look carefully, in moderately small print, is an article at the bottom on how did the moth change its spots. Was it by natural selection? They finally get down to tell you we are no longer sure of the relationship between pollution and the moths changing colour. Okay, now the section in the textbooks usually industrial melanism, evidence of natural selection, under the heading of evolution, proof thereof. But if you ask, what have we actually proved? Well, in 150 years, black and white peppered moths have turned into black and white peppered moths. So, peppered moths have produced their own kind. I mean, if you start with peppered moths, you end with peppered moths, what evidence would you be looking for that they have produced their own kind if you're brave enough to ask that question? In fact, we're no longer sure, as the museum said, that natural selection's got anything to do with this at all. Look, don't get me wrong, I have no problems with natural selection, it happens every day. But the one thing it isn't doing is making the moths evolve at all. Oh, fossils with a question mark after it? Why do I do that? Well, I was asked to do a section on the BBC last year against Steve Jones, and he'd just not long before that done that lecture to the Royal Society. You see, my background's in geology, and I'm fascinated with people who make statements like that. The finest evidence of evolution comes from fossils. But of course, he's involved in biological stuff, so his definition is evolution is genetics plus time. Okay, you might not see it now, but given long enough, it's liable to happen. But then he introduced in the talk an amazing concept. You see, Steve Jones used fossil, HIV, AIDS virus. Fossil, this is the most unusual way I've ever heard it used, because he's talking about fossils from 1959. And he says that, look, over these 50 years or so, the HIV virus has turned into many varieties of HIV. Therefore, he believes descent with modification is true. Therefore, and he ultimately, as a rampant atheist, does not believe anything more than natural processes is required to turn hydrogen into people. Therefore, chemicals can naturally, from minimal non-life information, because hydrogen really doesn't contain anywhere near a fraction of the information as DNA, can actually, by themselves, without any brainy person outside, they can turn into things like DNA. Therefore, life is the inevitable result of the natural properties of the universe. Therefore, I know that because that's exactly what he said to me on the BBC. You see, Steve Jones' logic is not actually based on evidence of HIV evolving in any way that Charles Darwin's theory really needs to prove it. What he's doing is wearing those glasses. If I see any change, I'll call it evolution, and any change in virus must be proof of evolution, therefore I can't believe viruses were created. But if you then ask, let's just check the facts. From 1959 to 2006, the HIV virus has been proved to turn into HIV viruses without fail. Now, you might not yet know how it tricks the outside of its structure into fitting into your system, but in reality it starts as a HIV virus, and so far it has not altered to anything else. You see the same here. I was doing a bit of a debate the other day, and somebody brought this up as evidence of evolution. So did those two guys, the atheists Craig and I were debating last year. Observed changes in the influenza A virus. Look at the lovely diagram. We can plot up all these family trees. It starts as influenza A, and after all these years, it's turned into influenza A. I mean, you can actually figure out how many times it's multiplied itself. It replicates in 3 days. 14 years is 1,703 generations. You've had plenty of generations to observe, but it started as influenza A and it's finished as influenza A. Question: if you're brave enough to ask the question, what evidence would be consistent with God creating the world such that creatures produce their own kind? What would you be looking for in influenza A viruses? I'm not surprised my old mate Richard Dawkins said that on PBS in 2004. He's asked by Bill Moyers, is evolution a theory, not a fact? Dawkins replied, evolution's been observed, but look at this. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's been happening. Now, I don't know about you, but I have trouble with that statement. I mean, in case you missed it, we'll go back. Moyers says, is evolution a theory, not a fact? And Dawkins says evolution has been observed, but it just hasn't been observed while it's been happening. I mean, if you have HIV AIDS virus turning into HIV AIDS virus, what do you actually got? If you have influenza A turning into influenza A and finches turning into finches, I don't think you've got a very strong case except for saying that. You haven't observed evolution. You've extrapolated it because of what you already believe. So I'm not surprised that Dr. Kemp, Oxford University Press, Curator of Zoological Collections, Oxford. Now, I appreciate Oxford isn't Edinburgh University, but it's not a bad place. This guy's not a creationist. But look what he says. To account for evolutionary changes that take millions of years to completion solely by reference to process that can be studied only over tens of years requires an extraordinary faith. Even though he's an evolutionist, he's an honest man. You see, if you think this little change in HIV to HIV proves that molecules can turn into men, you have more faith than the most radical Christians I've met. Here's a challenge for you. I mean, you're going to have a chance to ask me questions in half an hour or so, but can you do any better than Dawkins and provide even one example of observed evolution that does not presuppose evolution has already happened? Because if you can't, then you live in a world where you know that things produce their own kind and the farmer stakes his future on it. Because if he's breeding pigs, he assumes he's always going to get pigs. Unless he's smart enough to take the degenerate ones, as you saw in the UK publication The Times just a week or so ago, when a farmer was breeding the degenerate ones, the tiny ones, because he was getting a lot of money from rich old ladies. But let's discuss real fossils. You see, this is more of interest to me, and you may have noticed that every Wednesday or Thursday, most of the press has a little release in it from nature or from science. How evolution kept frogs a jump ahead. The remains of the oldest frog ever found show it developed jumping legs to avoid being eaten by dinosaurs. Now, that's quite an amazing theory. It's a fairly accurate statement of the paper, which I went and collected, but it does raise a good question. Obviously, the frogs succeeded and the dinosaurs must have died out of hunger because the dinosaurs are gone and the frogs are still here. But how long do you have to evolve legs big enough to escape from the dinosaurs when they're catching? In fact, how many chances do you get at it? In fact, let's go on. The remains of the oldest frog. Now, the media is really good at sort of oversimplifying and selling ideas, so let's pull this apart, of course, because this is not just their release. These press releases come from Nature, prestigious scientific magazines. What's oldest mean? Well, basically, in a geologist's mindset, the rocks that are formed last are the youngest, the ones sort of at the top, and as you dig down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you run out of fossils. By definition, that's your oldest layer in the Grand Canyon and everywhere in between. You got the sort of idea? And so if you keep going down and you can't find anything that looks like a frog underneath this layer, by definition, it's the oldest one. The extinct frog, 4 specimens which have been found on a Navajo Indian reservation in Arizona, had a very similar skeleton to modern species. Now, I went to this reservation to actually look at some of the dinosaur remains and collect a few things there. Very friendly Navajos. Question: how did they recognise this was a fossil frog? I mean, nature is the report. You can go and check up the origin if you like. Answer: it had a very similar skeleton to modern species. Now, there's a modern species of frog. That's our Australian corroboree frog. You may never have seen one. They're so tiny, they live on sort of moss there, and very cute little guys. But if you've seen one of those, what do you think that is? Now, have you ever puzzled if you do a geology course and study paleontology, while even though you may not know the species name, you have a pretty good idea as to which sort of shell it is? Or the reason is very simple. You see, that looks like a dead frog that tried to cross the motorway. Didn't get across to the other side. In fact, to go on, these fossils show that the body plan of the frog, and this is a quote from the author, has remained almost unchanged over the last 190 million years, so it appears to be very successful, says Professor Neil Shubin, University of Pennsylvania. Okay, he believes in all those vast millions of years. I no longer do. It's not relevant to the issue we're talking about here at the moment, but if you want to raise it in question time, that's fine. But I have a couple of questions that you need to ponder. Number one, if this is the oldest frog, how did he recognise it was a frog? Number one, it looks like a dead frog. Number two, if you believe it has remained largely unchanged over 190 million years, then what evidence have you got for evolution? Or is this creature really stuck in a rut and it's producing its own kind? You see, it doesn't matter if you make that 6,000 years, 6 million or 190 million. The time doesn't change the data at all. But here's what you do need to notice, particularly in the media. Not so much in the original reports. Headlines were how evolution kept frogs a jump ahead. The evidence, how frogs hadn't changed. Oh, that's dirty. Because you and I mostly read the headlines. Let me prove it to you. National Geographic. Was Darwin wrong? Great sales line. Look at the answer. No. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Now, notice one thing. Big print, smaller print, smaller print, smaller print. Now, let's be honest. Most of us don't buy National Geographic to read it. We look at the pictures. And as a result, they can tell you lots of things that you miss, like you've already read all they want you to see. The evidence for evolution is overwhelmed. Now, let me get you overwhelmed. In the small print at the bottom is that. Illuminating Butt's body, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 out of every 1,000 frames have been lost. As far as I can see, that's an accurate statement. Okay, would you watch a movie that had 99.9% missing? That's not much of a story. Now, I'll be honest, one reason why I started to doubt evolution was doing a geology course in which you could ask the professor, but if this is true, where are the fossils? Well, his answer in the end turned out to be something like that. 99.9% of them are missing. That's why Charles Darwin, if you read his original book, basically says the fossils are the worst part of his theory. It was the geologists who kept telling him in those days he was wrong. Question. What would you be looking for from frogs? I mean, the real fossils, not the HIV bit over 20 years, to establish either of those. The evidence that frogs used to be non-frogs, or the evidence that frogs have always been some kind of frog. You see, Charles Darwin, who graduated with a master's degree in theology, knew exactly what it was he was getting rid of. He knew exactly that if he'd proved his point, then the Old Testament, with its manifestly false history of the world, which means this guy here at Destiny Church is out of a job because he's got to be pathetically sympathised with, is someone who's so out of date it's not funny. Don't be surprised, it can be emotional. Well, look, let's try and begin to round this section off so you've got a chance to ask me some questions. Have you kept up with the genome studies? You know, the standard sort of argument they use in advertising? We share 98% of our genes with chimpanzees. Visit your relatives this weekend at the zoo. That's a big promotional program in some countries. Well, let's have a look and see what's happened to this debate, because you may remember back in the year 2000, the world's press heralded Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. Remember him? Okay, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton announced the success of the Human Genome Project. The very next day, the press blasted the fact that humans and chimps were 98.4% the same. Therefore, we were elated. Therefore, evolution is a fact. Funny thing, if you kept track of measurements, by 2005, the claimed percentage of similar genes has ranged anywhere from 90 to 99%. But if you listen to the original report, did you catch this? 75% of human genes are found in nematode worms and half of your genes are found in bananas. Which should raise the question as to what do all these numbers actually mean? Oh, and look who said it. The UK chief scientist, quoting in New Scientist in July 2000, commenting on the genome studies. I mean, does this mean when you eat a banana you're half a cannibal? What does it actually mean, these numbers? Well, haven't you asked those questions? Why has the percentage varied so much? I mean, if we are 98% the same as chimpanzees, should we be more interested in the 98%, or should we be interested in the 2%, which it must be the reason why they're not here tonight listening to me? You see, that must be a significant difference in some way, shape or form. Well, I'm always grateful that I did decide to do genetics, because when you just look at living things and sometimes don't consider what's making them be themselves or be different, it pays to remember when we're talking about the genome, we're talking about codes. And we're not just talking about Windows 2007 Vista. We're talking about unbelievably sophisticated codes. The genes are definitely strings of chemical code letters. And it's a fact, because we had to play with them. I don't know if you've ever done it, but we rip the salivary glands out of Drosophila melanogaster forever and a day, shoot them full of radiation, and then try and see what happens. Yep, you can change the genes, you can mess up the code, you can make a difference in obviously the outputted meaning. But for those of you who don't do genetics, you're reading English code. If this was Hebrew, you would have started the other way. But most of you can't read Hebrew, so it would have wasted my time as an illustration. But this is English code. Now have a look at what happens when you work with codes. God is now here is a message. It contains information. It is a message that any Christian in this room, including myself, actually believes. Okay, let's change the code. God is nowhere. Oh, hang on, I actually haven't changed the letters. I have 100% the same letters, and I have 0% similarity in meaning. In other words, when you're dealing with codes, the simple percentage the same is a meaningless figure. Look at this one. Those of you who are agnostics hope that's true, because if it isn't, you're in serious trouble. Those of you who are atheists hope that's true. Those of you who are Christians probably annoy the dickens out of the atheists because you keep telling them that's true. Only a change like 6.25% and you can have the world's 3 religions on the planet with no trouble whatsoever. In fact, to illustrate it, the bigger the amount of information communicated in a code, the more easy it is to change the meaning, simply. Mr. and Mrs. John Smith request the honour of your presence at the wedding of. Is that actually what you meant? One of the attendants stood on the bride's brain and tore it. Oh no, you actually didn't mean B, did you? You meant T. And so the bigger the sentence gets, the more profound a tiny little change can actually affect the whole communication. They tell you that at school? Gorillas and chimps have got 48 chromosomes and you've only got 46? Seems to have been left out of my information, but I hope it's in yours. Did they tell you that? In 2004, a detailed study comparing a single chimpanzee chromosome, number 22, to its closest human equivalent, revealed an 83% difference. Now, don't just take my word for it. I may be good looking, I may be Australian, but check out some of this stuff for yourself. Actually, that's interesting. You see, doing this genome stuff actually costs quite a bit. So back in 2000, when they told you we were 98.4% the same, it was before we'd actually done any detailed study on any chimpanzee chromosome. So the press did not actually tell you the truth in 2000 at all, despite the fact that it's a popular statement. In fact, did you see those results in your daily newspaper? I find the press amazing because something which can be a headline this week and is proven false 10 weeks later on gets a 3-word retraction just under the funeral notices 2 years later. Have you noticed those, particularly in association with this area? Things just disappear and you're left with the impression it's still the same. Oh, did you catch that one? You see, that's not all that long ago. Further studies have revealed 35 million single substitutions difference between you and me and the monkeys, 5 million small insertions, deletions, local rearrangements and a chromosome fusion. You see, the more we study, the more these differences seem to be popping up. If you want me to translate that, if you've got 2 authors and they're writing detective books with exactly the same number of letters in them, and yet one has got 35 million different letters, you are not reading the same story. You see, the significance is if you're only throwing a ball 100 yards, then being plus or minus 2.4% out is not very far from the wicket. But if you're throwing a rocket 10 million miles, then plus or minus 2%, you ain't going to get where you want to go. The bigger the number, the more significant that percentage becomes. But have you caught up with the BBC this week? You see, start of the week, Monday, that's not too long ago. And all these modern things like MP3 downloads and that, you can check these anytime you like. If you don't remember Craig Venter, he's the guy who was trying to outdo the Brits when it came to the human genome studies. He's best known for sequencing the human genome, and he's gone on to try and patent artificial strings of DNA, with the race to make life in test tubes, etc. Here he is, just Monday. His interviewer, Andrew Marr, the variations are bigger. Look what he says. We're now probably at least 1 to 2% different from each other. Just a short while ago, we thought we were only 1.2% different from chimpanzees. Wow, how data changes. Question, if you and I are 1 to 2% different from each other, what on earth does the meaning have of if we're 1.2% different from chimpanzees anymore? Becomes absolutely irrelevant. You now need to know what the code actually communicates, rather than simply the percentage differences. So if you want to see some of the most significant differences, it's a little bit on the rude side because it should be in every textbook, but it's not. It's too embarrassing to sometimes talk about. Have a look at this, cousins of the orangutans and chimpanzees and all that. What do you notice that's different compared to your skeleton? Particularly if you're a boy. Do you realise that adult male chimpanzees will never need Viagra? I know this wasn't in your biology course, but they have a bone in their penis. And for penetrating the female, they don't need a dynamic pump system like male humans have. Just don't need it. In fact, if you wanted to ask the question, could you ever evolve from a creature whose mechanism for penetrating a female was to have a permanent bone in its penis, could you ever evolve into a human mechanism? The answer is if you don't get it right in 1 generation, you're extinct. You can't do that. By the way, that is a very significant difference, no matter how small the percentage of genetic letters are. Well, let me try and make a few closing comments to sort of provoke you, hopefully. Have you heard the comment that not only is creation unfalsifiable, creationists can't make any predictions? Both of those statements are nonsense. Darwin was the first to think of how to falsify creation or test it out, see if it was true, see if it was false. And he's ultimately, as I hope I've showed tonight, not actually proved his point at all. There's what I suspect you could actually predict. kinds are actually real. Did you catch Charles Darwin's textbook, Origin of Species? I've got no problem with making new species. We can make them all the time. Inject colchicine in tobacco, if you like, or rose bushes. You'll make a new species overnight. But you start with species 1 of a rose bush, you end with species 2, you start with roses, you end with roses. I predict that mechanisms will exist which will actually stop you evolving. We may not know what they are at the moment, but we've got a good start. There's all these repair mechanisms in your body that actually stop your mutations accumulating. Real clever little doodads, right, that run backwards and forwards along your DNA, checking. I mean, you've got radiation coming into this room at the moment, and the one thing it will do is split the, you know your genetic code ADTC, the thylacine and the adenine, etc., and the thymine and the adenine. Well, normally they link up with each other, but the bond is a weak one, so any radiation coming in actually splits them. And then an interesting thing happens. Thiamine much prefers to bond with thiamine than with adenine, so it does. It zips over and bonds with the nearest thiamine and messes up your whole genetic bit of information on that string. Well, you have a little doodad that comes along, checks for errors, and actually forces it to be repaired. Interesting. That's not very helpful to evolution, by the way. If you were created by God, then you will have a mechanism in you that is designed to enable you to survive. But look at this one. Death and aging will be found to not be programmed into your genes. Why do I say that? Well, you see, back in Genesis it says God made everything very good and death is not part of the system. It's something else. Well, we'll get to that just before the end. There's what I predict about the fossils. All kinds of life, whether it's frogs or whatever, will have appeared suddenly and separately, and I don't care what age you put on them, it doesn't alter the argument at all. Where they come from is what you're trying to figure out. This will be the norm. Have you heard of the punctuated equilibrium? It's really arguing that in the fossils, well, once they appear, they seem to be inherently stable. Don't forget, snakes and humans can devolve, degenerate. In fact, if we go one step further, if you want your Nobel Prize, then there's what I'd encourage you to do. Since life exists only because it was created, if you want a Nobel Prize for making life in a test tube, you will have to play God and intelligently design it, because it is not a natural property of any molecules or any system that exists naturally in the universe. So here's my closing sort of comments. Many theories and opinions contradict everything in the Bible, but the facts don't. You see, there are many philosophies that do, but tonight I hope we want to stick to facts. In fact, I'm going to be that provocative, and if you want to suggest evidence that denies that, you'll have a chance to do so in the question. But remember where we started? Why such a fuss? I couldn't state it better than one atheist did. Christianity has fought, still fights, and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. What's the connection? Destroy Adam and Eve in the original sin, and in the rubble you'll find the sorry remains of the Son of God, if Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. Now, he may have been an atheist, but he sure understood Christianity. God made the world very good. Nothing bad was made by him. We sinned. You can't blame God for bad things. We made the choice. The wages of sin is death. You do not die because you get sick or get old. You die. It's a penalty for sin. Now, that's not what's in Biology 101. That's a radical difference. But you see, therefore, when Jesus Christ comes and he doesn't sin, do you remember Mel Gibson, the other famous Australian? Made the movie The Passion? And he got one bit accurately quoted from Jesus Christ where he said, "You can't take my life from me. I choose to give it up for you." That's an interesting statement. You see, the Bible records that Jesus never sinned. And if the wages of sin is death, if you don't sin, you shouldn't die. But if you don't sin and you do die, you're not dying for your own sin, you're dying for somebody else's. That's what this is about. You get rid of Adam and Eve in the original sin and you have destroyed the whole of Christianity. It's impossible to avoid doing it. Of course, on the other hand, you establish creation, then you've gotten rid of atheism. So don't be surprised, there's a fair bit of prejudice here. And look, there's the connection again. Jesus Christ said, if people don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be convinced by a tiddling little resurrection from the dead. So if you're not a Christian here tonight, no, Pete, you really want people to become Christians, don't you? In fact, it's one reason why you've invited a controversial bloke like me here. If you're not a Christian tonight, then probably the chances are as a university student, your problem is not with Jesus Christ, because he appears to be a pretty nice bloke. Your problem is with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, and you can't come to grips with that. Well, if you want to